So, allow me to ask another question of you. You seem to know much of my worlds, but somehow only be right for a temporary amount of time. What can you tell me about something that nobody really understands, but many people know?
Lord, that's a really loaded question, you know that?
Everything about my questions are loaded. I do not have a ranged weapon on the field. I need everything to be loaded.
Fair enough. Okay, something that everyone knows about, but nobody knows correctly. Okay, let's talk about pleasure worlds.
The pleasure worlds. You know my kind do not have reproductive organs anymore, right?
See? That right there. Okay, let's get into this subject. Pleasure worlds go by several names: paradise worlds, pleasure worlds, and sometimes called garden worlds. I prefer paradise world, honestly, because it's more in line with what they're actually used for. It's a really odd name, as they could be anything from an entire planet like Hawaii, or some lush forest like the Aokigahara forest in Japan. Butchered that to sin. These worlds are primarily forested areas with temperate weather on average. Of course, with how weather can be, different parts of the world should be different climates, but every planet in a future setting tend to have one overall weather over the entire planet, despite that not being how it works, unless the planet has almost no atmosphere or too much atmosphere. But let's ignore every single thing about every single sci-fi franchise.
Franchise?
Never mind. Now, these worlds do have citizens on them, who usually work in tourism services: hotels, massage centers, lifeguards, tour guides, and the such. Machine life is very few and far between on the worlds, in an attempt to keep the air of the world as clean as possible to give as much, quote, pleasure as possible out of them. Machines that would definitely be used would probably be some hand-used stuff like lawnmowers or path makers. I'm certain there are also some servo machines too, likely for cooking or cleaning, if they had the resources to keep them from burning too much fuel and polluting the air. Now, the primary use of these planets are, as I mentioned before, vacationing, really. People who come to the worlds for vacations are essentially two types: the rich and the navigators. The rich fall under the government positions of the worlds, to inquisitors who've earned enough to chill, to even church members. I mean, I'm an American. I'm wondering how any member of a church can afford anything, but then I remember there are mega churches, which I look down on despite being Catholic, which definitely falls into that mega church category.
Catholic?
Not important. Now, with the name Pleasure World, most people would think they're like breeding grounds for Slaaneshi corruption. But that's a very broad misunderstanding of both the worlds and Slaanesh. In order to talk about that, we need to explain Slaanesh in general. Slaanesh is a weird thing. She is often tied to pleasure, joy, and enjoyment. But really, the Chaos Lord is more like the idea of taking from another to give to yourself. Murder, debauchery, theft, and other things I won't talk about. The idea of Slaanesh and how Slaanesh corrupts and claims is when one says, I need more, following through with that as well. Having fun with, say, playing a board game or a war game or watching sports, or that's not Slaanesh. It's not going into excess. It's not taking away from another. It's simply a fact of life. There's a lot more to Slaanesh I could get into, but I might talk about that in a future subject if you're interested, Trozen, my new friend.
I would probably enjoy that. Yes, human.
David, either way, now with that about Slaanesh said, most of the worlds are vacation homes. On pleasure worlds or paradise worlds, you are not really intending on fucking your neighbor's wife while he's away playing poker with buddies, then leaving her bleeding filled corpse on the bed. You're intending on chilling out, having a beer with some friends. Does that mean there aren't absolute orgies? No. The Imperium of Man won't tell anyone not to have sex. Sex leads to reproduction, which means the Imperium will grow. Hell, we can bring up a few factions of the Imperium as having the weirdness with that. For example, Adepta Sororitas has a questionable view. Some older books say that the Sisters of Battle are entirely celibate, but newer ones imply that they're allowed to have some hanky-panky with people. Since the Imperial cult does promote humanity, and what's more human than fucking like rabbits? Of course, as I've been saying, relaxation and vacation isn't the only thing that paradise worlds are used for. Some are used as training for soldiers of all sorts of factions, from the Marines, who would go there to learn about forest guerrilla tactics, to the Imperial Guards, who will likely go to these worlds with an attempt to understanding how to work on said planets with softer grounds and greater covers. Marines might be using these to figure out how to sneak around on dark green worlds while being a giant blue deformed man.
You seem to have an increased amount of aggression with that. What causes your frustration?
Matt Ward. Moving on. Now, these are why the Imperium wants to keep their hands on the Paradise worlds. There's a few reasons, like churches and such, but what about other factions? Do they want the Paradise worlds? Eldari might look at some garden worlds and remember them being part of their old empire. The Eldari had a habit of taking a planet, turning them to lush green garden worlds, and calling them maiden worlds. Eldari are an odd faction, where they tend to be overly emotional, but when something else returns the emotion in turn, they get confused. For example, Harlequins cutting people up screaming, "We come in peace!" Or Yvraine getting confused as to why Gilliman won't work with her, despite her trying to manipulate him by putting him in a life support suit and saying, "Work with us or we'll kill you by turning this thing off." So Eldari may attack the world, then get confused as to why people are defending themselves. Hell, I could go into a long discussion about my hatred of the Eldari there, and their 3-4 factions, despite being 2 armies. It'll come in the future, okay? Tyranids may also be interested in the worlds, as they might see them as easy biomass buffets. There's not a whole lot of meat suits running around on these worlds. There's some, don't get me wrong, but not near as much as, say, on a hive world. If they had a reason to look at a vegetable and decide to have a salad, they might go to the worlds to eat them. But not very likely, given there's not a whole lot of reports of the bugs coming for a more verdant world. Tau don't really look at them with much care. They've got small empire that can't expand easily, given it borders on the Imperial space. So they're pretty much stuck there. I imagine a few have gone to Garden Worlds. Some suggest Farsight's Enclave's world is on something that would fall under the Paradise World category, but I don't think they fought anyone over it. They just found it outside the Tau Empire's realm and decided to hide there. Necrons don't give a shit. You know that, Trazen. Your kind really don't care unless someone trespasses on your home and wake you up for your nap. 13th Crusade, right, man?
That guy rang my doorbell and interrupted me looking into a thing called the Mona Libra.
Mona Lisa. But even the Imperium screws up the names, so whatever. Chaos, however, all depends on the specific faction. Khorne don't really give a shit about Paradise Worlds. They're boring to him and carry no honor. Nurgle might want them to do some tests of diseases, but it's better to test diseases on a more highly populated world like a hive world. Slaanesh might have some fun with some people getting a bit crazy, but he doesn't really pay much attention to them because they're too relaxed. Tzeentch, however, ain't nobody got a clue. Nobody knows who Tzeentch is doing, why or when, until it's done. Chaos Marines fall under that whole category as well. Some warbands might attack them only because they came from those worlds and want them for their own. Maybe.
So, Paradise Worlds are meant to relax, sometimes train, sometimes worship. Not many care for them, simply because they do not provide much. The Imperium of Man values them, but given what you've said, they'd be more likely just to give them up if the war becomes too much.
Yeah, pretty much. Got anything else you want to know?
Yes, will you be doing a review on Monday?
Probably. I think I'm going to actually talk about Pathfinder First Edition, but until, Sunday, I really don't know for certain, so just shove off.